The Hill has always been the hub of the arts and creativity. And it is here that the building blocks of a Singapore identity can be found, at Fort Canning Hill. Once, this was the seat of power, the resting place of pioneers and people of faith. It's a memory landmark of our childhood years and of our lives in modern times. The Hill has seen all of the major events that shaped us into who we are today. From here, we can tell 7 centuries of our story, our history from the hills. John Turnbull Thomson painted this 1850 celebration of the founding of Singapore. Today, the Hill is still a place of gathering to celebrate, to create, and recreate. From this vantage point, we gather a collective memory of snippets of life in the recent history of Singapore. The Hill was the site for learning and education. The National Museum began its life here in 1887. Later, in the 20th century, a National Library was built. The building has become a memory landmark for many now in their middle age. Another major repository of our memories is the National Archives, situated at the Hill with its back to the slopes. This used to be the home of the Anglo-Chinese School, which moved here in the late 19th century. One of the more prominent members of early ACS was Henry Martin Hoisington.
Every ACS boy would know a bit about my grandfather.
Karen is the granddaughter of Martin Hoisington. She discovers her ancestry through research done by former ACS boys. The Hoisingtons were missionaries, originally from Ceylon.
Grandfather would have been about 10 years then, and he studied in ACS for 2 years before returning back to Ceylon to continue his studies. And there he received a Queen's Scholarship to study mechanical engineering and mathematics at Cambridge University in UK. In 1909, he came back to Singapore and took the appointment to be a teacher at ACS. And there he taught for 24 years, from 1909 to 1933. He taught mathematics, which he was well known for, but he could also teach engineering and physics, including even literature and classics. So he was very diversified, or shall I say, a very well-rounded teacher. The legacy he left in ACS was the school anthem, which he set to the Maple Leaf, the Canadian national anthem. Besides the school anthem, grandfather also created the motto of the school, which is still used today, and that motto says, "The best is yet to be." So it gives you an inkling that he saw each of his students with great potential and not to be satisfied with where they're at, but to press on and press in, and that the best is going to come.
Karen, a former creative director, has now turned to teaching, continuing the legacy of her grandfather.
If I were to meet my grandfather in person, I think we would click quite well. We would get on very well. I think he will see that I may have his similar traits. I'm now a teacher as well, and that's part, of the legacy that he's left in my blood, so to say.
Though it's been years since he left school, Raymond Ang still finds the school motto and inspiration in his life.
Whatever we do, we can exceed, we can excel. To never be satisfied with what you've done. I think that is something which a lot of ACS boys take away. And if nothing else, they remember that about the school. The best is yet to be.
By the time Raymond went to this ACS, it was solely a primary school. Queuing for admission into top schools was a phenomenon that began in the early 70s.
My parents had to line up 3 days and 3 nights to get me into this school. And they used to tell me if I failed, I would have to line up 3 days and 3 nights to pay them back for it.
Raymond, a risk manager, takes us back through some cherished memories of the school.
Now let's have a look at some of the old places from the school. Here used to be behind the main block, and this is where the badminton courts are. and they're not drawn, they're actually made of mosaic. If you look carefully at this one, this photo, this is what the Boys Brigade, and this photo actually shows you this place where it used to be back then. This is where the canteen used to be, and just outside the canteen, I would think these are still the same places. There were these drains here, and these drains are where we used to sit down or squat and brush our teeth. Each of us would be given one toothbrush and a small tube of toothpaste in order to help us to learn personal hygiene. And the classes would line both sides of the drains, put the toothpaste on the toothbrush and start brushing. Squatting down, invariably you would have water walls and everybody would be trying to spit on each other's shoes across the drain.
The dental health program began in schools in the late 60s and became a common routine for all school kids for the next 35 years.
To us, Fort Canning is very much a part of the school. We did some PE sessions up there, physical education. We had cross-country runs up there where there was not enough space in the school. Here we have the huge steel gates that guard Fort Canning Gate. Because back then we didn't know this was a gate, a gateway to another area. It used to be locked in the old days. On occasion where it's open, we would find our way in and we would make our way up there. This here is the roof of the fort, and we used to come out here and play war games. I think for us, it was a link to the past, and the fact that it still stands and we could come and play with it freely was something that was very exciting.
In the late 60s, the park was left unkempt, gates of glory fading in pre-war paint. Another section of the park, known as King George V Park, was gaining focus, becoming a source of national pride. After the war, the eastern part of the hill lay abandoned. On the western side, facing River Valley, a new park was created. They called it King George V Park. In 1963, a new Singapore institution was built, National Theatre, a public commemoration of self-government in Singapore. Its structure presented modernistic ambitions for a country whose landscape was then dominated by kampongs. For more than 20 years, only the most important event was staged at the National Theatre.
I graduated and the convocation was held at the National Theatre.
We actually had our 125th anniversary celebrations for SJI.
When I was a 9-year-old kid, and I had to go there to see one cultural show called the first Southeast Asian Cultural Festival.
I think the National Theatre was one of the most creative-looking buildings.
5 diamonds representing the 5 stars. There was actually a fountain that kind of represented the crescent.
And I would remember running around the fountain, you know, the fountain that looked like a crescent.
It was something that everyone identified with Singapore.
The National Theatre was, I tell you, like hell.
When I was a young student at Common Holy Infant Jesus, HIJ, we would have some concerts there.
Anyone who attended any of those performances, you would find that you're actually locked in.
So I saw Louis Armstrong. As people who've been there know, it wasn't air conditioned.
There were no ceiling fans because the ceiling was very high.
It was really hot. There were some fans on the side.
All you had were wall-mounted fans.
But if you happen to be in the middle of the theatre, it was hot.
And they can't actually reach the audience.
So I remember watching Louis Armstrong in a tuxedo. The whole band were in black tie. They were wearing tuxedos.
Once the show starts, the doors are closed.
In a full tuxedo, playing a set. Because he must have been suffering, you know. It was not a comfortable venue.
You can't even, take leave and go to the toilet.
So if you bought the cheaper tickets right at the back, you most likely have to bring your umbrella.
The moment the show about to start, they closed and locked the gate down. And that's it. You're locked there for the next 2-3 hours.
There were many people who were non-paying. You know, they did not pay a cent for the tickets because you could watch from up on Fort Canning, the hills.
It was kind of open, you know, from one of the terraces of the hills, you could actually get a good view inside of the theatre.
They could look down for free. And the authorities were in charge of the National Theatre didn't have to put a curtain down, to prevent these poor guys, from watching. So it was a more tolerant society then.
The National Theatre was demolished in 1986 because of structural weaknesses.
I felt this, there was this huge sense of loss, this huge loss to something that a symbol, loss of a symbol that symbolized Singapore and our nationhood.
Good riddance.
In the 70s, the entire hill was renamed Central Park, in keeping with the national campaign to create a greenery-rich landscape. When jogging came onto the scene, the hill became a popular jogging venue, as it is still today. In the mid-70s, it was the focus of the squash fever.
Fort Canning Centre became a hotbed for squash activity because someone in his wisdom thought that it would be a great idea to turn this colonial building into a sporting arena.
Munir Shah was the manager of a team that led Singapore to fame in the international squash arena.
We came in 6th in the world, which is unprecedented, and I don't think we will ever, reach, such a position, And that was really the heydays, the 80s and the 90s.
Anthony Chua, Zainal Abidin, Peter Hill, Lim Seok Hui, Stuart Ballard were some of the names behind an Asian squash powerhouse. They brought Singapore into world attention. The mid-70s saw increasing wealth to Singapore. Parents could afford to send their children for overseas studies. Squash was experiencing a world revival.
During the days when we were a colony that the British brought the game to essentially through the armed forces.
It was mainly an elite sport.
Many of our Singaporeans who had studied overseas and picked up the game whilst they were studying
At that time, soccer or badminton is the only sport that is available.
They came back and brought the game to the local scene.
The availability of squash court open to public like the Fort Canning, it really opened up.
I remember that you had close to 20 squash courts in this particular complex.
With more than 20 courts available, Fort Canning Squash Centre shifted the game from elite to popular. Today, Munir, Zainal Abidin and Anthony Chua revisit the former heart of Singapore squash.
In 1984, I remember coming here almost like every day. Right? I was doing my national service. I came here almost like every night.
This is the only place where it becomes a hub for the good squash players to come. And of course, this also is a good place for us to train.
After I got out from camp, walk up the steps, of Fort Canning, train here for about 2 hours to 3 hours, and then going back to camp just before midnight.
I use the slope here, to do my endurance, running from the bottom there and run up, about 6-7 times. Fort Canning was more a choice of all the players at that time, that they like to congregate, and even if they don't play squash, they will come to Fort Canning and sit down and just to make sure that is everyone okay, just to see their friends, then off they go, So it brings a lot of memories about this place.
I distinctly remember that they were all upstairs, majority of the courts.
But there, I think on the ground you probably have about 12 to 14 courts.
All right.
And upstairs you probably have about 11.
There was never an air-conditioned court at all. I think so in the 80s. Of course, there's no glass court actually.
Exactly. So these were all concrete courts at the back. Yeah.
All back, the blood, sweat, tears, all comes from around this complex. Whether it's the hill or whether it's
With our own breed of world champions, squash fever was further fueled by an explosion of courts over the island. And then it hit downward spiral.
We reached, I think, probably the saturation point towards the late 1990s, where there was an overbuilding of squash courts in Singapore, and then slowly the numbers dwindled, from 16 courts, went down to 10, 12, and They survive perhaps on 3 chords. And like everything in life, they go in cycles, and I thought that the late 1990s was perhaps the beginning of the end, in terms of our domination in the Asian scene.
Squash's glory days ended by the turn of the century. The courts were converted to suit another purpose, and another Singapore identity was taking shape: the arts. The 80s, some would say, was the beginning of the golden era for Singapore. Strong economic growth, a burgeoning middle-income class, and greater wealth within our grasp. The physical landscape was changing in tandem with the mood of growth. In 1981, the entire hill was made over and renamed Fort Canning Park. One of the key functions of the park was to encourage the arts. An ASEAN sculpture garden was established and a home built for the performing arts.
In the 70s and 80s, we were very, very conscious of trying to create Singapore theatre. In other words, a theatre that was created by Singaporeans, Singaporean writers, and performed by Singaporean performers, and also directed by Singapore directors and produced by Singaporeans.
Actor Lim Kay Tong is one of the founders of Theatreworks, a company whose headquarters was at Fort Canning and whose productions spearheaded the development of Singapore plays.
Theatreworks had this whole wing, it's half the ground level of Fort Canning Centre. In here was the reception area, and then some of the admin staff would be seated here, and in that inner office would be our artistic director, Ong Keng Sen. Going back to the beginnings of, let's say, a theatre industry, there was none to speak of at the time that we set up Theatreworks in 1985. So that was the only way we could create work for ourselves. So we went ahead and set up a company with the idea of creating jobs for ourselves. The rehearsal room, which is a huge bare space that we had. All our rehearsals were generally conducted in there. But in the early days, you would just rehearse until whenever. Because we were younger and I guess hungrier, we just did whatever it took. The Black Box, which is actually a little outhouse where we created a little theatre. It's an empty space. It's totally bare, and we would adjust the seating as depending on the kind of show we were doing. It's pretty oppressive inside actually because it's small, and we as a company were renowned for having really bad seating, so the seats were like really uncomfortable. There were no backs. In the mid-1990s, we did site-specific plays, which means we used every aspect of the park. So we had a play called Longing, where there were 20 overshows going on in one night, all over the park. I did a show, a one-man show on top of the fort gate up there.
I remember driving up in my little convertible MG and, parking up there and discussing, the concepts for the play that they were at. So I think they really, in a way, owned that little part of Fort Canning. They even had outside concerts and theatres. So they brought the hill alive.
Fort Canning was the birth, I think, of a lot of the experimentation that we embarked on and which we continue to do today. So it was a very, very important breeding ground for experimentation, which is appropriate, because we were given this wonderful space in beautiful surroundings. It was ideal.
Today, preparations are being made for yet another festival at the park. Since 2000, the park has become a major venue for international arts and cultural events. The park is also synonymous with an event of a lifetime.
That's where I got married, a restaurant marriage 50 years ago.
For many of us, the strongest emotional link to the hill is the Registry of Marriages, or ROM. The registry was created upon the passing of the Women's Charter in 1961, designed to improve and protect the rights of women. One of the outcome is the solemnization of marriages.
You see, in those old days, before the Women's Charter, the Chinese, especially those with money, the rich tauke, they show their wealth by marrying a number of wives. In fact, more than one wife. For example, my grandfather, my granduncle, each got more than 3 wives. So that's how they show their wealth.
Heritage blogger Philip Chew was one of the pioneering couples who married at the registry at Fort Canning. He takes us back on his journey from a single to a married man.
During my time, it was the transitional period. There are those who, although the Women's Charter was passed, a lot of Chinese still use the marriage certificate, Chinese marriage certificate, and they don't go to ROM. But in my case, I mean, most English educated boys or girls, when they get married, they will go to ROM. When I came here, signing the marriage certificate, I felt that part of my freedom has been lost. My marriage was not a matchmaking because I knew my wife for about 10 years. In fact, we were courting for more than 10 years. So everybody was waiting for this very day for us at the registry here. After the ceremony, we have group photograph inside, and then we have one main one just outside the main door there, and it was in black and white then.
Since that time, the ROM has gone through a series of makeovers. Today, it offers a wedding with the park as backdrop. A new generation will layer its memory upon 700 years of history.
In a way, we are developing today a new set of social memories about Fort Canning for a younger generation of Singaporeans.
It's gone through several transformations, but it's always been this green island at the very center of Singapore.
So for me, Fort Canning is more like a Wikipedia. I mean, everybody may be able to edit the story of Fort Canning.
Any writing of Singapore history, the rewriting of Singapore history, starts and continues with Fort Canning today.
We've only scratched the surface of a myriad stories and memories. A treasure trove of others lie in wait to discover, to create history from the hills.